Day of the School of Psychology and Marriage and Family Therapy Integration Symposium. We have a couple reminders for you today as we get started once again. If you happen to post on social media, I know I joked about that yesterday, but we do encourage you to do that if any of you are posters or integrative influencers. Maybe that's a new category we could create, integrative influencers. Please use the hashtag Integration Symposium 26, and that would be fantastic. Again, for those of you joining us online, if you're looking for the translated version of the program, select that function in Zoom, and then instructions will be provided in the Zoom chat if you're looking for translation. Again, important for those visitors with us today, restrooms are located outside in the back of the breezeway along the green wall there, and the restroom code is posted on the lobby, in the lobby doors there for you. Again, if you're receiving CE units and joining us in person, make sure that you're signing in and out at the beginning of each session. And for those online, make sure that you're signed into Zoom with your full name so that your attendance can be recorded. CE evaluation surveys for each session will be mailed out following the event. We will have a time for question and answer again today at the end of this plenary. For those of you online and in person, the number to text is on the screen, or will be coming hopefully on the screen, 323-473-4795. Should I wait for that? Is that going to show up? It is there. Oh, okay, I can't. Oh, there it is. Sorry. Yeah, so again, we don't do in-the-room questions. You text them in, and then we can read them out loud to you. So, before we begin today, some of you who have maybe been here for a while know that usually on the last day of the Integration Symposium, I open with a poem. I do that because A, I like poetry, and B, I'm in charge. And I usually try to capture a poem that, or try to find a poem that has somehow captured some theme for us. And this poem is called The Opening of Eyes. And I feel like we've been asking all of us today, with courage and vulnerability, and we'll do more of that this morning, to open our eyes, to see what we don't see, to mind those gaps. This is from the Irish poet David Whyte. The Irish, of course, have a very interesting history in terms of colonialization and also becoming white over time. And so this is a poem by David Whyte entitled The Opening of Eyes. That day I sat beneath dark clouds, the passing light over the water, and I heard the voice of the world speak out. I knew then, as I had before, life is no pressing memory of what has been, nor the remaining pages in a great book waiting to be read. It is the opening of eyes long closed. It is the vision of far-off things, seen for the silence they hold. It is the heart, after years of secret conversing, speaking out loud in the clear air. It is Moses in the desert, fallen to his knees before the lit bush. It is this man throwing away his shoes as if to enter heaven and finding himself astonished, open at last, fallen in love with solid ground. The Opening of Eyes by David Whyte. Will you please welcome with us our dean, Dr. Cynthia Erickson.
Good morning and welcome to day 2 of our Integration Symposium. Minding the gaps. So yesterday, we were challenged to think about what it means to pay attention to the gaps, to become aware of the gaps related to our own positionality, our own privilege, our own power, and then also to become aware of the ways that there are gaps even in our ministries, like worship, and how we can engage together in relationship to pay attention and engage and maybe limit or bridge some of those gaps. Then we were also reminded in the sessions that I was part of by Dr. Jeff Chan of the ways that there are internal restrictions, barriers, challenges that get in the way of our own participation in that process of bridge building and dialogue. And I'm going to take with me that encouragement to say that internal reflection, if I'm not open to being surprised, I'm not actually doing the reflection. I'm just managing my own identity. Yikes. So that internal challenge. And then we were invited with Dr. Jessica Chen Theng and Dr. Saul Barcelo to think about what are some of those external challenges that keep us from building bridges and instead make us build walls. And I was also challenged to think about the ways that empire influences what we do. And one of the words that I will take with me is, as a leader, to always ask the question, what am I centering right now? In the decisions that I make, in the encouragement that I give, in the voices that I raise. So I'm challenged. I hope that you're challenged. I'm so grateful for the space that we've created and the ways that Fuller keeps leaning into these conversations and leaning into creating clinicians and scholars and leaders who care about virtue, who care about things like the clinical virtues of our MFT program, things like humility and compassion and hospitality and peacemaking, things about like virtues like curiosity and courage. So I would love us to be open to the transformation that God has for us and some of those challenging questions that we'll take from day 2 and keep building and forming into the people that God has created us to be. So will you pray with me? Lord, we are in your hands. You are our God, our provider. Your Spirit inspires us, indwells in us, and seeks to make us more whole. Help us pay attention to the ways that you are inviting us to be bridges, that you're inviting us to be in courageous conversations. Help us to grow in those virtues of compassion, hospitality, humility, curiosity, generosity, and courage. And help us to be lights to guide people away from some of the predominant experiences of fear, greed, isolation, and pride. Help us to build your kingdom and not the empire. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. I am delighted to introduce again our presenters for this morning, Dr. Brad Strawn, who is the Evelyn and Frank Fried Chair of Integration, Professor of Psychology Integration, and our Integration Chair in the School of Psychology, and also Dr. Christin Fort, who is an Associate Professor of Psychology and our PhD Chair in Clinical Psychology. So I'm excited that they are going to bring us even further into this conversation and invite us to think about vulnerability and the ways that vulnerability needs to be part of our lives, our work, and dare I say, the transformation that we are doing with God's support. Correct. So blessings, welcome.
Sorry.
Welcome back to the Integration Symposium. It's delightful to see your faces, some faces that were here yesterday and some faces that are new. For those who have returned to join us year over year, thank you. One of the privileges that it is to be here co-chairing the Integration Symposium with Dr. Strawn is the privilege of watching the transformation that we have as a community over time. For those who drive in or fly in to be here year over year, those who've converted from driving or flying to joining us online, we're grateful for your presence. We thank you for your participation. For those who were here yesterday, you recall Dr. Strawn saying that our title for today, the theme of this year's symposium, is Minding Our Gaps, Cultivating Courage and Mutuality in the Face of Power, Privilege, and Positionality. And he reminded us that the reason for this topic is because power and privilege and positionality are always a part of what is shaping us and forming us, but they're not always aspects of our realities that we're attending to. And so today we want to dive in more fully, not only into attending to power, privilege, and positionality, but acknowledging the vulnerabilities that arise for us in clinical, ministerial, and academic spaces that many of us live in. So I want to say something briefly as a recap, beginning to say some of the themes that emerged from our conversation yesterday for those who are with us. When we think about minding our gaps, we're acknowledging the need for the virtues that Dr. Erickson was mentioning a moment ago. We also acknowledge that minding our gaps involves the purposeful decision to allow ourselves to see and to be seen. The purposeful or intentional decision to allow ourselves to see and to be seen. I don't know about you, but when I think about being seen, whether that's both literally in this moment, people watching me, or emotionally more deeply in some type of interpersonal conversation, it brings up a lot of emotions for me. Some positive and delightful, and some challenging that feel risky or overwhelming. I do believe that to be truly seen for all that we are in our beauty and in our mess, is to be exposed, is to be vulnerable. And that is a type of risk that I think is an invitation for us as humans that we don't always take advantage of. I think it's an invitation that we have to allow ourselves to be vulnerable. And today, as we wrap up the Integration Symposium, our hope is to continue to explore what vulnerability looks like and to think about the courage that is required for genuine, interpersonal, meaningful engagement. Before we dive into the rest of our content, we think it's important for us to pay attention to what Scripture says here at a seminary, for those of us who follow Jesus, which dare I say is most of us, if not all of us, to think about what the text of Scripture has to say about some of these themes, why we talk about these things as the people of God. I'm going to read this passage for us, and then we'll say more. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 17 through 22 read, "Now I don't praise you as I give the following instructions, because when you meet together, it does more harm than good. First of all, when you meet together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and I partly believe it. It's necessary that there are groups or differences among you, some translations say, to make it clear who is genuine. So, when you get together in one place, it isn't to eat the Lord's meal. Each of you goes ahead and eats a private meal. One person goes hungry, while another gets drunk. Don't you have houses to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God, looking down on God's people and humiliate those who have nothing? What can I say to you? Will I praise you for this?" Paul asked. "No, I don't praise you in this."
Well, you biblical scholars probably know what's going on behind this story, but the early church would gather for the Lord's feast. And what was happening there in Corinth was that there was really issues of power, privilege, and positionality. There was class distinctions and cultural distinctions, maybe even racial distinctions in some ways. And what was happening was that the wealthy would go first, and they would gobble up all the food, as you literally hear here. And that the poor would be last, and there'd be nothing left for them to eat. And Paul says this isn't community. This is, in fact, a gap, right? I'm surprised he didn't put gap in here. There's a gap here. And it doesn't bring honor to the Lord or the church. It divides you. It's not a good thing, he says. And in fact, what you're doing is not just that it's a bad thing, but it's humiliating people. It's destroying their sense of self and who they are in the world. And I find that to be so powerful and meaningful and moving and, frankly, frightening. Mm-hmm. Because how do our behaviors at times that maybe we're not even aware of because power, privilege, and positionality are, in fact, not just excluding people, but humiliating them. Making them feel less than human. So this to me and many other places in Scripture, Christin will probably add to this, but feels like a biblical mandate for how do we live together, how do we break bread together, how do we worship together, how do we do school together, how do we exist together? Mm-hmm. And so here we hear it in at least one powerful place.
That's right. I'll add to that to say that choosing this text feels especially significant to me. This happens to be a passage that my pastor in my home church growing up would read every single time that we gathered to take the Lord's Supper. So every month, our church celebrate the Eucharist or communion or the Lord's Supper once a month. Others are every Sunday. Others are different times. But he would always read this passage. And so I hear his voice, actually, as I read this. And he would say at the very end, in the NIV translation that we read, "Shall I praise you for this? Certainly not." That Paul would look at the church in Corinth and say, the way that you gather, the differences are not the problem. You're actually supposed to have different people among you. The text literally says, no doubt there ought to be groups among you. There will be differences among you. But how you deal with those differences, how you attend to them, ignoring them is not an okay option. Neither is allowing this gathering to take place the way that it quote unquote naturally does. Where those who are wealthy and who arrive at the feast, the Lord's Supper was an actual feast, by the way, not like a little wafer that we now have symbolically. An actual feast of people gathering to have a meal. That the people who had access and ability, whose bodies could allow them to arrive at the feast earlier, who had servants to take care of things at home so they could get there earlier and eat the food, they ate the food first. They had all they desired, even getting drunk. And others who arrived later, there was nothing left. This isn't about just being nice to the poor. There's a way of gathering for the people of God, a way of attending to class and power and race differences that Paul is saying to the church, pay attention. I do not praise you for this. Which of course begs the question, then what would Paul praise them for? How do they engage? How do they relate with one another? It's the question that I think is for us a theme over the rest of our time for this plenary presentation. How do we engage? What do we do? How are we intended to do that well? In order to unpack that a little bit further, I'll turn it over to Brad to say more.
We're just going to redefine our terms from yesterday, okay? So we're not going to go in as deep as we did yesterday. We hope you were here yesterday. And we also recognize, as Dr. Fort said last time, that there are different definitions for all of these. But we're talking about power, positionality, and privilege. So power we're defining as the ability to act or produce an effect, to control, authority, or influence over others. It's also, as we talked about, and I think we heard this several times throughout the course of the day, it's the ability to name reality. It's not against something we've earned, it's something that's given to us, to certain people, right, and not to others. Privilege, then, we're defining as a right, exemption, or immunity granted as a particular benefit, advantage, or favor, a prerogative. Again, it's a right or benefit given to some, but not to others. And again, with this same kind of issue as power, privilege is not something that we earn, it's something we find ourselves in, given all the different kind of social locations, which again we'll talk about a little bit here later, which is related to this actually. Positionality is the social and political context that creates your identity in terms of race, class, gender, sexuality, and ability status. And then again, of course, from that, that's what throws us into these different power and privilege settings frequently. Positionality is also described how your identity influences and potentially biases your understanding of and outlook on the world. So again, so I think we talked about this in terms, it's not just what you know, but it's from where you know. So your positionality in the world, based on all these kind of social locations, these intersectional identities, which we'll talk about, shapes the world. Merleau Ponty said that we intend the world based on our embodied experience. I don't know if I think that's super cool, but I'm kind of geeky on Ponty. But we see the world, we perceive the world based on our embodied experiences, which has everything to do with positionality.
That's right. I'll add to that to say, leave it here for one moment. We don't have this on the slide, but you might recall from yesterday, we talked about intersectionality being another key term. Some of you all are familiar with that term that was coined in 1989 by a professor of law, Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, Esquire. She's not a doctor, but we'll give her the doctorate that she has as a JD. But she coined this term in 1989, and some of you know, based on her work as an attorney, looking at the intersection of gender and race in particular, and noticing discrepancies in how people experienced their time at work, and also funding differences. We now have lots of proof about the differences that exist in gender gaps for women and men paid in many different industries. And legally, There wasn't much precedent to talk about how gender and race might layer on top of each other. How they weren't just distinct things, but if you belonged to particular communities, there was an overlap. And Kimberly Crenshaw did a beautiful job in her very remarkable work saying we see this pattern over time in multiple places, how different aspects of who we are might layer on top of each other in ways that can be overwhelming for some and might be exceptionally privileging for others. We want to acknowledge that though this term isn't listed on the slide, intersectional aspects of our identities where gender, race, culture, language of origin, nation of origin overlap are all going to impact the ways that we experience the world. We know this in our heads, but sometimes we don't allow that truth to sink in. And so we want to say, as we think about these primary terms for us, there are a few things we think are important. Not only for regulating our anxiety as we begin to talk about some of these things, but to allow the truth to sink in. You might recall yesterday, we talked about the importance of awareness. If we're talking about some of these terms, trying to understand ourselves more fully, it's important for us to acknowledge whatever it is that is reality before us. If we're thinking in terms of a rupture in a relationship, where I say something and offend you, or you do something and hurt me, the first step to be able to hold or contain that type of interpersonal rupture is to be aware of it in the first place. To acknowledge that it took place then would be part number 2. As Brad and I were talking about this week, I said, I think awareness and acknowledgement are sometimes conflated. We think they're the same thing. Well, if I'm aware of it, then I'm acknowledging it. I think sometimes we can be aware of something taking place and then choose to ignore it after we notice it. This happens a lot in life, like, oh, I noticed this person was sitting alone in the room. Bummer, I hope they're okay. Everyone else in the cohort is all talking and laughing. Oh, I noticed something else was taking place here, and then kind of just ignore. But what does it mean to be aware of something, then to allow it to sit with us, to acknowledge it as something significant, both internally and then sometimes to the other person? If we're thinking about interpersonal rupture, what it means to be able to say, that really happened. I really did that thing, or that person really did that thing to me, and it had an impact. Having an impact then is connected to point number 3, is accepting the weight of what we have observed and acknowledged. In this case, if we're thinking about ruptures, we can acknowledge that it had a negative impact on me or on someone else, and it might be that an appropriate response is guilt. I have some sense of feeling, Christians might say, convicted. I did something, whether intentionally or unintentionally, and I need to attend to it in some way. That attention is not only meant to be intrapsychic in my head, but also interpersonal in some real way, where I act in some real way. Now that I've observed what has taken place, acknowledged it, and accepted it for what it is, how will I respond? Christians might say, how might I repent? Turn away from what I've done in the past and do something different, do something new to hopefully bring repair to the relationship or to the system that I'm a part of, not only interpersonally, but also in the wider community and broader world. Awareness, acknowledgement, acceptance, and action, we believe, are these important internal and interpersonal and then also social realities that become really important. Before we move on, I just want to say briefly, we know that psychology has a way of biasing itself towards the individual. We find it easiest to only think about me and you. Me and you, though, as we know, exist in a wider world, a wider community. It's significant for us, then, I think, to take these same 4 realities and to apply them to the socio-political, religious context that we live in. To allow ourselves to be aware of what is happening, to acknowledge what is happening, to accept the weight of what is happening, and then to act. We believe those 4 invitations are all difficult. Being aware alone is difficult. I was speaking with one of you earlier and talking about how some of what's going on right now might be connected to the news. And someone here said, oh, did you hear this news update from yesterday? And I said, no, I didn't hear it. And I both didn't hear it because I just didn't have the news on yesterday with the symposium, but also because I've purposely decided not to listen to or watch the news for the last 3 days leading up to the symposium. Like, I can't handle it. I just need a break. Whatever's going on out there, I'm going to stay here. But I can do that for a few days, perhaps. But choosing to stay unaware in general is a choice that requires some discernment. But is it actually responsible for me not to know what's happening in the world? There's always the question of how do I regulate how much I take in, right? What's appropriate? What feels too overwhelming? But what does it mean for me to make space at the very least to be aware and to allow that awareness to shape me in some real way, leading towards prayerful, appropriate action? So then when we think about all of these things in light of power, privilege, and positionality, we think about these questions connected to psychological implications. We get to ask this question, what comes up for me or for us as we consider the realities of power and privilege and positionality? My power, my privilege, my positionality. Your power, your privilege, your positionality. The power, privilege, positionality of those in authority over us, whether they are local or national or global leaders in some way. We know that when we think about these questions, often we have a wide range of affective or emotional responses. Sometimes we're filled with confusion and uncertainty. Now that I realize there's this power differential, now that I pay attention, I'm aware to some of these dynamics that might lead to a lot of questions that I have. How did that person get that power? Should they have that power? Do I have more power than I realized I have? What do I do with that if that's true? We might also experience some frustration and defensiveness. Oh, I didn't ask for this power. What do you mean I have this power? What do you mean I'm misusing the privilege that I have? I think about when microaggressions take place, when someone says something or does something that's disrespectful. What it means then to say, well, I didn't mean to. I think about the worst form of apologies that I ever hear, which is, I'm sorry you were hurt by that. Yikes. I mean, if you're genuinely sorry I was hurt by that, I appreciate that. But that's different than I acknowledge my role in hurting you. I'm sorry that I said this thing that was offensive. I'm sorry I did this thing. Whether or not I intended to is actually literally beside the point. It's another point. And what does it mean then to be able to not only be defensive, but to be able to lean in? But acknowledging that frustration and defensiveness is a strong temptation. Along with these experiences sometimes can be this deep experience of overwhelm or anxiety that leads to distancing. What does it mean instead to be able to make space and to be able to acknowledge that overwhelm, to sit with the anxiety, to contain it, and then to move through it, to work through it together, ideally in mutuality?
I just want to go off script for a second.
Go for it.
And I want you to stand up and stretch. Move around a little bit, check out your body, see how it feels. By the way, you're allowed to do this all the time, right? You're grown-ups. You're not getting a grade from us.
True.
And then, feel free to sit down when you're ready. But if you need to stand up at any time, move throughout the room. Again, as we said yesterday, if you feel anxious or activated, triggered in some way, we want to both invite you to lean in, but also to take care of yourself. So if you have a seat, I'd just like for 1 second to take us through a box breathing exercise. I'd like us to just get back in touch with our bodies, okay? And lots of you know how to do this, and we won't do it for very long. But box breathing, what you'll do in a second, if you feel comfortable, I invite you to close your eyes if you feel comfortable. Again, as Resma Menakem would say, begin by looking around the room. Make sure you feel comfortable here in this space. If you'd like to close your eyes, you can do that. And what I'm going to have you do is to imagine a box, okay? So, get comfortable. I want you, if you feel comfortable, close your eyes. If not, you can just soften your gaze. And I want you to imagine in your mind's eye that you see a box, just the front of the box, 4 sides of a box. And we're going to begin on the left side of that box, and it's going to light up. And then we're going to move to the top of the box. That's going to light up. Then we're going to the right side, going down, and that's going to light up. And then we're going to go across the bottom of the box. And I'm going to ask you to breathe into a count of 4. And as you're breathing into a count of 4, imagine that left side of the box lighting up. Then you're going to hold for a count of 4, and you're going to imagine that top of that box lighting up. Then we're going to exhale fully to a count of 4, and that right side of the box will light up. And finally, we're just going to hold in that space now, empty lungs, for a count of 4, and we'll just do that a couple times, okay? Again, we know physiologically that when we become overwhelmed, our frontal lobe goes offline, and we need to be able to bring our body back to a relaxed space so that our amygdala, our limbic system, is not controlling running the program. There's times for it to run the program when we are unsafe and we need to move. So we're not against limbic systems or amygdalas in here. But there are also times when, especially in these difficult, vulnerable conversations, we want to try to find ways to stay regulated. So I invite you to close your eyes if you're comfortable. Begin to envision that box. And now I'll invite you to breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4, and hold. 2, 3, 4, and exhale deeply. 2, 3, 4, and hold there. 2, 3, 4. And now just take a cleansing breath, a deep in-breath, and exhale. We'll do this one more time. I'll go a little slower. Again, as we're going, keep imagining the sides of those boxes, that box lighting up. And just let your body relax into this. Notice your shoulders drop. Notice your face relax. Any tension in your body, notice it and let it go. So again, with me, breathe in. 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Exhale. 2, 3, 4. And hold. 2, 3, 4. And now a deep cleansing breath again. And exhale fully. And open your eyes and come back into this space. And I hope you might feel just a little more centered, a little more regulated. That's super easy to do. You can do it anytime. I do it a lot, depending on what my day looks like. You could do it before seeing a client. You could do it after seeing a client, before going into a ministerial context, before preaching a sermon, before leading worship, whatever you're doing, giving a presentation. So just invite you kind of into those spaces as well. Really quickly then, we are talking about different types of identities, and we just have, I'm just going to list them because sometimes we forget them and they fall off our radar, as Christin has said. Ability status. What is our ability status? I like to say that we are all on the continuum of ability status. That changes over the course of our lifetime as we get older or we have an illness or a chronic illness, which really talks about our dependence and need for one another. Socioeconomic status, of course. I still think that sometimes we don't talk enough about class in the United States of America, that there's a lot going on in the world right now that is related to class. Education level. Those of us here probably, again, often take this for granted, but if you are a first-gen person, you probably don't take it for granted, right? And I love Jessica's picture of her graduation she put up there yesterday where her parents were wearing all her regalia. That's right. Right? This is their degree as much as it is hers. Religious affiliation, denominational affiliations. Again, we mentioned yesterday about a lot of times in integrative literature, our Christianity and the particularities of that are hidden. They're implicit. But if you're from a different tradition than the author and you read that, suddenly you go, something doesn't quite feel right. And of course, we worship differently. We engage with one another differently. I'm always surprised. I'm not surprised, but sometimes in class, and I know Christin has this experience too, that a student will say, well, all Christians believe. That's the quickest way to separate yourself from your cohort, is to say all Christians believe, okay? I, as a Christian, have always believed. I have learned this, right? My perspective is very different. Race, of course, we've already been talking about that. We had a great workshop yesterday on being biracial or multiracial, which is often not talked about near enough. Ethnicity, of course, as well. Our gender, and again, that's become more complicated than when I was a kid, frankly. And so I've had to do a lot of learning around this. And my students, again, have frequently helped me with that. Heart language. You want to say something about that?
I do. Language is a piece that often is missing. For those of us like myself who are monolingual, I can speak 15% of a different language, that doesn't fully count. But for those of us who are monolingual, we're not often paying attention to when we need to shift between languages and the entire constructs that exist between how we think about the world, how we perceive the world, the emotions we can communicate using different languages. And thinking about the fact that our ability to speak multiple languages or not impacts our entire experience of the world. And it's something that is really significant, particularly for those who are in a culture that is not using their heart language, their dominant language, their first language. I put heart language here as opposed to first language because people have different languages that really resonate with the depths of themselves. Often that is our first language, but not always. So what does it mean to pay attention to the ways that our experience of language shapes so many different aspects of ourselves?
I love when working with a client who is bilingual or multilingual, once in a while they'll say, there's a word in my primary language that describes this and I can't translate it. And I say, tell it to me. I don't know how to translate it. You don't need to translate it. Just tell it to me. What does it feel like when you tell me that word? Something different begins to happen, right? They can say a whole sentence. I don't care. Because there's something about the heart and there's something that's being activated in them. And there's also, usually for me, it's a great honor. It tells me something about them feeling safer in the space with me to be able to use their heart language.
Can I say one more thing?
Please.
About that? I'll just make a brief note. Language is such a significant thing on so many levels. I'm going to acknowledge briefly the Super Bowl halftime show that some people saw and some people didn't for various, very significant reasons. I want to acknowledge for all the complexity there, theologically, ecclesially, interpersonally, psychologically, on all the levels. Language was one of the major things that was a point of challenge for folks, among many. And what does it mean if we hear something that is not in our first language? What does it mean to be able to experience something powerful, whether or not we understand cognitively what is happening? It's a question that's significant in every context, and as Brad was talking about in therapy, what does it mean if someone tells me what they're feeling in their heart language and says it? And even if I can't comprehend intellectually, how can I hold? I still am with you in the emotion. I'm still with you in what happened. That brings up complex feelings for us and for the other person. But it's significant to at least consider, regardless of the other complexities that are also important to consider.
Sexual orientation, again, we had a wonderful presentation yesterday from Dr. Chan. We'll have another presentation on sexuality today from Barnabas Lin, who is a PhD student in the School of Mission and Theology. So you may want to be a part of that as well. So that's another identity. And then, of course, currently we're all thinking a lot about, and many people have been thinking a long time about this, right? So some of us are just newer to the conversation, unfortunately, but is immigration status. And I think when I came in this morning, I heard protesters again. There's a group of protesters right over here somewhere who I think meet weekly and are protesting ICE and the use of force and the profiling. And as we heard yesterday, again, Latin and Asian individuals are being particularly targeted.
That's true. If we think about even what's coming up also later today, we also have another workshop focusing on immigration.
Yes.
Immigration status, immigration and faith, immigration and collaboration. What does this mean? How do we attend to these things? What does it mean to actually be aware and to attend, to acknowledge, and then to act? And not to act alone, but to act in community, to act with discernment. There's so many different ways to act, so how do we discern, how am I supposed to act? And not just curl up into a ball under a blanket and try and ignore it all until it goes away. It's not our best choice. With that being said, we want to talk briefly about thinking about how these different aspects of identity, different aspects of our experience of the world might be experienced in difficult ways, these underprivileged, less privileged ways of experiencing the world. We wanted to highlight the fact that there are many ways that various aspects of identity might be experienced at once by certain communities. From thinking about intersectional identities that coexist at one time, I think, for instance, of an Asian American male, someone with high socioeconomic status or high access to financial resources, who may also be a recent immigrant to the United States. So regardless of his class and his gender, which would put him in a higher significant position of privilege, as a recent immigrant to the US, especially post-COVID, thinking about anti-Asian hate that has led to targeting of life, let alone all the other ways that make life difficult. It's an underprivileged position for him. We could add language and thinking about how well he knows English. He might be completely fluent with no accent. He may have an accent of some kind. We think about then his relationship in his church. I've had the privilege of spending some extended time in Asian and Asian American churches here in the US, and I think about the role and status in the church and what that does for folks. So I think about those who might also be an elder in their church community, how that offers a point of privilege, a place of affirmation of the sense of self, place of engagement and community. And all of those realities can coexist at one time. This underprivileged experience as a minoritized person in the US, this privileged experience with higher socioeconomic status, this underprivileged experience as immigrant status is newer to the US, this privileged experience of elder in the church. That one person at one time can hold multiple realities of privilege and lack of privilege simultaneously. I think, for instance, about a white male who might be lower in socioeconomic status, who is a US citizen and no one ever questions that for him. He's a college graduate and has access to resources of some kind, some education, but also is a queer person, identifies as a member of the LGBTQ+ community. What does it mean to hold privilege and lack of privilege in multiple aspects of ourselves at once, and to acknowledge that complexity of experience, rather than simply saying, you must be privileged because you're white. And it's true, he is privileged because he's white. That's not the only experience that he has of the world. It's not the only way he's perceived. It might not be the most salient aspect of his story, but it's a part. I think then also of a Latina, someone who might be of Latin descent here in the US, who holds a PhD, a highly educated woman, in the top 1% when it comes to education and knowledge. We think about what it means for her to be solidly middle class. She's not at the top, upper echelons, but she's doing fine financially. What does it mean for her to be second generation and the complexities of navigating her first-gen parents, her third and fourth-gen nieces, nephews, and all the complexities therein as a second-gen straddling, being in between the Napantla that we talked about yesterday with Dr. Jessica Chen Feng and Dr. Barcelo. What does it mean for her to be a US citizen, and whether or not her family does or doesn't hold citizenship? The complexities there. What does it mean for her to be heterosexual? The privilege that comes there. What does it mean for her to be single? And I intended to put single in the church. So shout out to single people in the church like myself. That's exactly, I'm glad I'm not alone. It is a significant place to think about how marital status, which I prefer to call relational status, impacts how we experience the world. There is a privileging of marriage in Christian spaces that is noteworthy. Marriage is a gift from God. Marriage, dare we say, in some traditions is a sacrament, a holy thing that makes those who are married hopefully more holy, more like Christ. It is beautiful. I believe in it. But what does it mean then for those of us who don't belong to that community, who are not partnered in that covenantal way? That's an underprivileged status in the church. We can have lots of conversations about that, what that looks like. It doesn't always have to be. Perhaps in the Catholic Church, if you're a priest or a nun, it's not underprivileged. But in the Protestant Church, we don't tend to have that place of honor for singleness. What does that mean to think about multiple things intersecting at one time for one person? And how do we think about how that impacts someone's experience? We know that the more minoritized identities that might exist in one body, that there's a higher degree of risk for stress, for traumatized experience at once. When you have multiple minoritized identities, right? I could have put someone who had every single type of minoritized identity. What does it mean to hold that? As psychologists and therapists, we need to be thinking about how those aspects of identity shape how folks show up in the world, how they enter our sessions. And part of why that's important to us is because often they're not going to come in saying, these are my most vulnerable parts of myself. They're going to come in with what they say is their presenting problem. They'll come into pastoral counseling, right, to say, Pastor, I really need help just with this person. But there are other things that they're bringing that shape that experience, right? And it's important for us to be mindful as the clinician, as the pastor, about some of those things.
So again, what we're talking about here, right, is really integrating with and between persons. So I hope you can hang with us like these big ideas, and then we want to keep bringing it down to relationships between people. The clinical setting, the ministerial setting, wherever you're doing your work, these things are operating. So when we work clinically or ministerially, we're always working across difference. I tell my students in clinical psychology, you are always working across difference, even if your patient grew up on the same block as you did and is the same race and the same age and da-da-da-da-da-da, right? And even went through the same thing. There's something different. By the way, I'm not sure that you should see someone who grew up on your block. That might be challenging, but you don't live on the same block anymore. But it's challenging, right? So we're integrating across difference of each person's lived experience. And that's to Christin's point, is what are all these things going on that we're not talking about that are deeply influential? So this is for us why that relational integration that we talked about yesterday is so very important. This differentiation of self being so important. Again, really quickly, right? We'll come back to this, but differentiation of self, this ability to hold both thinking and feeling. It's really about the capacity to be able to regulate oneself and to sit in the tension in any relationship, even a disciplinary relationship, between the anxiety of intimacy and autonomy, right? Some of us are real good at intimacy, and some of us are good at autonomy. and put those two people together, and they seem to get married, and then they come see us, right? There's a challenge in that. But that's a kind of life experience that we're kind of trying to talk about. So again, when we're doing this person to person and keeping in mind the social, political, cultural that Dr. Ford talked about, again, we want to keep remembering, even though we're bringing it down 2-on-2, whatever it is, we got to keep remembering the position, power, and privilege of this work, which means that we have to be courageous, vulnerable, and mutual, which is where we're going to keep going next. So, what makes it difficult to be courageous?
Yeah. I think there's so many things that make this work a challenge for us. We do believe that to be courageous is to consider that our worldview might be limited, and dare we say, is incomplete. That the perceptions that we bring to the world, the perspective that we have might be solid, but it's not whole. Where the autonomy piece kind of has a limit is that I can't see everything alone. I need other people with me. Perhaps this is why Scripture says in Genesis, it is not good for the human, Adam, often translated man, to be alone. We often jump specifically to marriage with that, like that's why he gave him a wife. Perhaps that's why God gave him a person. Perhaps that's why we're meant to be with people. Those are theological conversations even about marriage that we get to have. We do believe that courage allows us to face these types of internal intrapsychic processes that can be quite difficult in terms of, for instance, cognitive dissonance. Here's an example of cognitive dissonance. Let's say I am in a relationship with my brother, and I love my brothers, they're wonderful, and let's say I say something or do something to my brother that offends, which I have done, sadly. And what does that mean? And if my brother says, that offended me, that hurt me, what you said, and I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. But he remains offended even after I apologize, which has also happened in real life. I'm like, oh, but I said I was sorry, but I tried to explain. And I think about the fact that as we have these conversations, brother to sister, sister to brother, I have to sit with like, oh, I've hurt him deeply enough that this is impacting our relationship. And I have to sit with, am I still a good sister? Even though I've hurt him so deeply that there's actually a bigger rupture than normal, that we have to actually work through in some real way. The dissonance is I can start to think I must not be a good sister in some kind. I must be a bad sister overall. Well, how do I then take in the feedback? I have hurt my brother deeply. I still desire to be a good sister. Perhaps I am, but we need to work through this in some way as opposed to just saying he just is irrational. He's not able to see, which was my default thought, by the way, as I think about some of the ruptures. Like, you're just not seeing what I'm saying. What does it mean to hold? You can be rational and even right and checking me in some way. And I can also still be overall a good sister. And now I have to figure out, how do I work that out? Something has to shift. I can't be a good sister if I keep saying or doing these kinds of things that have this type of impact. How do I sit with this tension internally? Another piece that might come up for some is the spiritual uncertainty when we think about being in vulnerable relationships and vulnerable spaces. When someone checks us in some way or offers some feedback that's difficult, calls us in, we might say, rather than calling us out, calls us in to be our best self, the person God created us to be. I can bring up some questions of like, wait, God, I didn't know relationships worked in this way, or I didn't know that I was supposed to pay attention to these things as a person who follows you. I can bring up questions that have to do with our spiritual life and our spiritual formation. For some, when we think about difference connected to power, privilege, and positionality, we have this deep fear of moral relativism. I hear this in class a lot, having Christian students asking the question, wait a minute, if we pay attention to perspective, to subjectivity, to my biases, if I think about how that shapes the text of Scripture, how that takes the sacred rituals that are important to us as people of faith, does that mean we're just saying everything is relative? It's just about your perspective. If I see this and you see this, it's just all about my truth. And that's a legitimate fear. I remember that fear as a first-year student sitting in this room 16 years ago. I remember literally thinking, I think they're telling me that everything is okay. Like, if you see it that way, and that's not what they were saying. That's why I came back to join them as a faculty member. But it's important to know that that can be a fear. We're slipping into everything is acceptable or anything is okay. No. But we are saying we have perspectives that we bring, even to what is taking place. And so we need to be mindful of that. We also know that any of these topics can bring up this emotional distress that we have to pay attention to, this anxiety or fear that we have to keep managing. And this reminds us of the importance then of this differential relationality model that we've been talking about, recognizing our limits, the limits of our knowledge and our perspective, feeling that our limits create vulnerability and threaten our loss of power, privilege, and positionality, and allowing ourselves to sit with that weight, allowing us to ask these questions about how do I act, what do I do as a result, and how do I navigate some of these things well in light of what I'm discovering. We also want to acknowledge that all of these realities in terms of power are impactful in multiple different settings that we might exist in. And we want to just talk about power dynamics for a moment that exist in ministry context. Power dynamics, we know some of them are obvious, like a senior pastor with pastoral staff. The senior pastor has that term senior, and often that means they're the ones running the show. Occasionally, by the way, you get an executive pastor who actually runs the show, and the senior pastor is the one who's kind of doing the other things out front. That happens in many different contexts, but often we have someone with a position of power, right? That's sometimes known in the title, and those who are the staff. What does it mean for those in ministry to be mindful of the power differential? Not only in terms of it's your responsibility to make wise, healthy decisions for the church and for your staff, but to also think that your staff might struggle to communicate with you when they disagree. That if, for instance, you have a staff that has both women and men, and we're adding then gender to this component, and you have a senior pastor who's a man and an associate pastor who's a woman, how does both the difference in your pastoral title as well as gender affect what you're likely to discuss if you'll bring up what's important to you, how that might be affecting even your dynamic? Think also of church volunteers and parishioners and congregants, how sometimes those who are volunteers officially actually have a bit more privilege than the regular folks here. The greeter at the church actually has something that they're connected to in terms of privilege at the church, something just to be mindful of. To say, I get to use that privilege to welcome, use my knowledge of our church context and culture to bring people in, and be mindful that other folks who don't have even this volunteer position that I have might not experience the church in the same way, so their feedback is important.
Head usher in my church wield absolute power.
Yes. That's right. Ushers have so much power. It's so noteworthy to think about. Academic spaces, we think about deans and department chairs and the rest of the faculty. There actually are power differentials for us to be mindful of. Becoming a department chair has been a humbling experience for me. I remember when I first got the invitation to consider being a department chair, and I thought, I'm a younger faculty member. How will that go for my older faculty, my more senior faculty? How will they receive me? Will they respect what I say? Do I actually just have like technical influence on paper, or is there actual influence in real life? What do we do with that? Those are real questions. Thinking about then the power, even though it's quite limited, of my position as a department chair, right? And the experience of the faculty who are working with me, alongside of me. It raises questions to pay attention to here. Now we have age or seniority as well as position. And there are two things to balance at one time. Faculty and student, this one's more obvious to us. The faculty hold much power, but not all power. I think students are becoming more and more aware of the power that they have, given the feedback that we get about a lot of what we do. And I think it's important to know, correct, our omissions and our commissions. But it's important to know students have great power, great influence, that the voices, especially collectively, of students really impact so much, not only in an academic system, but I think about something even like the civil rights movement. That took place because college students around the country said, I'm going to go and sit in this space until they serve me. I'm not going to ride this bus until someone says I can ride in the front or the back, and not only the back. It was college students saying we collectively will do something to impact both the schools that we're in, but also the neighborhoods and communities that we live in. There is great power, sometimes unknown. And what does it mean to attend to that power? We think about this in clinical context where we see there's a dynamic between therapists and clients. There's a great conversation about who holds the power here. The therapist does hold great power. This is part of why we don't say everything that we're thinking. Because when we're actually in relationship, if I say, this might be a good idea, a client will go back, and I've heard this happen multiple times. My therapist said, as if it was somehow divine. And what we say, as we know, is not divine. We are still quite human, but clients hold our words with weight. I think about the fact that now I go to churches where some of my pastors have been in therapy, and I'm so grateful for that. I see the difference in how they preach and how they lead because they're doing their own work. But I occasionally will hear in their sermons, I was talking to my therapist about this, and as I hear them say this, I think about the weight of the therapist for my spiritual formation. And that is nuts to me, to think about what happens in the session between my pastor and his therapist impacts what happens for me in our small group conversations and other parts of my life. We hold great weight and great power, often implicit and unknown. So what does it mean to name that, then bring it back before the Lord? Lord, show me how to wield this power well. Finally, when we think about the systems that we live in, therapists don't just exist in a vacuum. There's a whole system that shapes us. Again, Dr. Jessica Chen Feng talks about that medical industrial complex that affects not only medical doctors, but also clinicians. The insurance providers, who takes the claim, who doesn't, what you charge, how it goes, is connected to a larger system. And directors, executive directors in this space, training directors, actually also hold great power over against even those who are other folks with power like supervisors. And how do we pay attention to those power dynamics that are at play?
What's this? Oh, so I'll jump in since you're putting your mic down. You can't probably, I don't know how well you can see that really quickly, but we do want to say that power is not all bad.
Correct.
You can use power well, or you can use power poorly. And we'll be talking some more about that. But this is a table created from Malin Foer's book on the grammar of psychotherapy, examining power and privilege in clinical work. And here she talks about how you can have power over. That's often what we think about when we're talking about power, right? But we can also have power with, which can lead to collaboration and mutuality. We can have power to, where we're using our power to help create capacity and agency in another person, or we can have power within, where we're trying to, again, now in this setting, trying to help the person that we're engaging with to develop an inner authority and a kind of self-trust. I'll say more about this later, but when I'm doing clinical supervision, I'm really focused on power with, to, and within. I know I have power, and by the way, I always tell the students, listen, I want you to find your clinical voice, but you're under my license. So I actually privilege the student in the room with the patient. I actually say that because I'm not in the room, right? Now it's wonderful now that we can watch videos and listen to audio tapes and things like that, so we get more in the room. But even then, I'm not in the room. I don't feel what it's like, and I'm not my supervisee, because they have all sorts of different identity markers. So they're going to feel different things and be treated differently by the patient than the patient would treat me. But I still try to privilege what's happening in the room. What are you feeling in the room? And I'm trying, and I'll say, if things are getting wild here, I'll let you know. But I want to help them find their voice. I want them to develop confidence and trust. I want them to feel a sense of agency, and I want them to feel that what we're doing is a mutual, again, collaboration in the work. Oh, am I saying more here? Okay, sorry. I just said all this. That's great, so we could just keep moving.
Beautiful.
Yeah, so power with, collaboration and mutuality, power to, capacity and interagency, power within, inner authority and self-trust. Again, so using our power, whatever power you have, whatever context you're in, whether it's ministerial, clinical, as a boss, as an employer, to be able to, a mentor, to be able to create these ongoing sense of trust, inner authority, agency, and the like. So one of the questions I like to ponder, which is somewhat related to this, is sometimes as a therapist or minister, should I ever foreground race or power privilege when I'm working with a white person? So if I'm a white therapist, which I am, working with a white client, which I sometimes do, and my client is talking about power, privilege in various ways, it might be racial, might be gender, and something feels off, right? And I'm feeling those isms rising. I'm getting that uncomfortable affective experience inside of me. What and how and when do I say something about that? Do I say something about that? Not going to give you the answer, just going to leave the question hanging there.
So good. We have another matrix that we think can be helpful. It's adapted from the last slide that we saw a few moments ago. Thinking about the ways that different types of power and privilege as they intersect might be experienced. Think on the left-hand side about a therapist or minister or supervisor, someone with holding more power and more privilege in a relationship with a client or supervisee who also has privilege. We think about in this top left quadrant here that there's a similarity of privilege that they hold, and one of the risk factors that might emerge, and this is also the case if we're thinking about a white person with a white person, right, or a male with a male, or whatever it might be, there's a risk of blind spots that neither of us are paying attention to how this aspect of our identity is actually shaping our work. We might be really brilliant, really attuned, picking up on a lot of good stuff, but miss something because we share it.
Can I say something real quick about
Yeah,
that?
please.
I don't know how many times I've had a male client say to me, well, you know how women are. I remember one time a client said, you know how women are. I don't understand why my wife was so upset. And it was one of those moments where I sometimes we fly a little blind. And I just said, I'm sorry. You don't know why your wife was upset? Right? And I'm glad I intervened that way because then he said, oh, yeah, well, maybe, right, kind of, yeah, right? But that can be the collusion, not only that what you both don't see together, but sometimes am I too anxious to name that?
That's right. That's right. What does it mean not to just be like nod my head and just to hold it? Yeah. But it's like, oh, let me pause. Maybe all women actually aren't like this, one. And then two, maybe your wife had a point. What does it mean to think about those things, right, together? And that's a risky thing to do, but in some ways trying to avoid the risk of collusion. So you step into vulnerability to name the thing. And that's not only in therapy. This happens in pastoral work all the time. In ministry contexts all the time, there's these power dynamics taking place, and we only attend to part of the story and not the rest. We think about these other aspects of risk that come with someone in privilege, with someone who doesn't have privilege as a client. The risk here is reenacting oppression, as the right-hand side can show. We think about here someone with not having privilege in a particular way, but they still hold the role of a therapist or a minister or a supervisor, like myself, for instance, of a woman who might be a therapist or a supervisor or a minister, and I've served in all of those roles. But I also might be with someone who does hold privilege, and that's opposite to mine, right? So I hold some privilege, but not others as an African-American woman of enslaved descent. What does it mean to think about the complex, layered power that's taking place between us? I think about the moments I've had, one moment in particular in therapy of a white male client who is coming in, he's married, to talk about some of the relational issues going on, and eventually we wound up doing marital therapy with he and his wife. And all the complexities that emerged. And for a while, we weren't talking about race. He hadn't mentioned that his wife was a minoritized woman, so we hadn't talked about how that dynamic was shaping their marriage. And we didn't talk about this until I think session 5 or 6, where I remember him pausing and saying, it's significant to me that you're black. And I was like, okay, good to know. It's also significant to me that I'm black, but I didn't say that. And we were holding, he was like, I didn't know you were black when we first spoke on the phone. And it was a brief moment where I had so many curiosities about what do you mean? And he literally said, well, you just didn't sound black on the phone. It raised a whole bunch of questions for me, like, what does black sound like? Do we all sound the same? I think you might have a particular idea of what you think urban diction is that you've overlaid onto all of blackness. There's a particular way of speaking. I noticed this, I'm reading an audiobook and I'm listening to the person who's describing the characters, and everyone is described, and then there's a person who I know the author thinks is black, but she never says the character is black. She uses language that she thinks black people use. She uses idioms that she thinks black people use, but never in this 15-hour audiobook does she ever say that the character is black. I find that so intriguing. What makes that difficult to name? What assumptions do you have? Why do you think I will think she's black? There's so many things that become really noteworthy when we don't name some of the things that are our perceptions and assumptions and risks that come with that. Finally, we have here those who have some kinds of privilege here on the left, and this final quadrant here, working with someone who has limited privilege as well, and how there are opportunities for solidarity if we both are holding a lack of privilege space, and what it means for us to think collectively and intentionally about those dynamics.
So I'm going to keep moving through this quickly. We want to get to some other things here. But again, I've already mentioned this, all human relationships, I believe, are a kind of dialectic of difference. When we have these unacknowledged gaps, it can lead to therapeutic and relational impasses, a collapse of imagination, meaning-making, relationality, hope. I really like that line, actually, because there's a negative impact when this collapses. We lose our capacity to think together. It takes two minds to think. And if we lose the capacity to think about these things, then we lose the capacity to think about bigger things. And it becomes a problem for us, I believe. And then we could possibly collapse into shame.
Talked about most of this already, so I'll go through it as well, that we believe that self-awareness is so important when we're tempted to collapse internally, emotionally, to collapse into ourselves, to feel overwhelmed by what we're seeing, to be mindful of what's impacting us. We believe that mutual recognition becomes super important. For those who are here listening to Dr. Chan, he talked about Martin Buber's understanding of the I and the thou, old school language of a thou, of two people acknowledging that they're whole people. I'm a subject and you're a subject, not I'm an object and you're a subject, or you're an object and I'm a subject, but to have both of us in mutual relationship, subject to subject, leaning into the vulnerabilities that we experience that arise with courage, and learning to practice courage by tolerating anxiety and then moving from just toleration to actual appropriate self-regulation. In this way, we hope this allows us to hold our convictions and welcome the other in some meaningful way.
So, I want to learn to lean into my shame. I want to learn to befriend my anxiety. That is not what my body wants to do, right? Are you with me? You feel that? Shake it off. Check in with your body all through this. What does this mean? What does this look like? Well, someone who's helped me is a psychoanalyst here in Los Angeles by the name of Lynn Jacobs. She's written a lot of things, particularly for white therapists working across difference. And one of her articles is called Learning to Love Our White Shame and Guilt, Skills for Working as a White Therapist in a Racially Divided Country. It's powerful. So one form of shame, Christin already alluded to this, is being treated like an object when you wish to be treated and deserve to be treated and should be theologically and psychologically treated as a subject, right? Sometimes, Jacob suggests to us that white shame, what white people feel, may be when a white person does this to a person of color and recognizes it, becomes aware of it. Now, oftentimes, we don't have that awareness. So again, those four list of A words that we talked about become so important, but awareness is important.
Can I just clarify?
Yeah.
It's when a white person may objectify
Yes, thank you.
a person of color or someone who's minoritized in some way. That's what we're getting at here, this objectification, even if unintentionally.
Yes, thank you. And then, what is often referred to as white fragility is when I defend against the shame I have felt because I have now objectified the person of color. And then there's So this is a quote from Jacobs. If I resist my guilt, I resist knowing my privilege. If I resist my shame, I remove myself from the emotional experience of my assault on the dignity of the others that my privilege enacts. We live in a complex space of emphasizing differences, often through projective mechanisms. This gets a little psychological, right? But many people have written about, oftentimes, things that we don't like about ourselves, we then project into other people. And we have been able to think and talk about this racially, so white people can project into people of color aspects of being human that they don't like and don't want to deal with, don't want to think about. So we other, right? We project those out into other people, which again is objectification. And so we can emphasize difference through that projective mechanism. Well, we're not like that, but those people are like that, right? Or the other thing we sometimes tend to do, Jacob says, is to collapse into sameness. Well, we're just the same. It's like the comment I made yesterday about the pastor who said to me, well, at the end of the day, we're all human, right? Which, again, I think I understand what this pastor meant, but I also have a lot of questions about what he meant. So I just want to say something about this really briefly, although to me it's really, really powerful. Jacobs names this phrase, what if we could meet by seeing where we cannot meet? Let me give an example of this. So I've been privileged to do a lot of work with women over the years, because why? Women come to therapy more than men. And so I've been able to work with a lot of women, and in the last, 10 years or so, it seems like I've had a lot of kind of women who have become moms during the course of our work. Become a mom, then 2 times, and I'm thinking of one patient 3 times a mom. And understandably, they bring to therapy the challenge of that, right? And the challenge of maritally working that out when a new system, or the system has to adjust, right, to these new foreign invaders. And so sometimes couples are doing really great, and then these kids come, which they both want, they claim, and then everything goes to hell, right? And I have had numerous experiences where the mom patient, the patient who is a woman, who, all different walks of life, some of them had careers, some of them had chosen to stay home with their kids, whatever it was, and they're talking about the challenges of this. And I'm empathizing, and I'm listening, and I'm wondering together with them, and I'm holding the marital relationship in mind, all these kinds of things. But if I'm not careful, I start to collapse a little bit into a kind of sameness. And what that looks like for me as a male working with a female is I might start to problem solve, right? Well, have you talked to your husband about this? Or so tell me about how you're disciplining the kids, or how do you set up your day, or I wonder if you got up a little bit earlier. Now, I know we as therapists, we say we would never say that. But let's be honest. We get caught, we get pulled into that. Countertransferentially, because we want to help, right? That's what we tell ourselves. But I'll never forget a patient who said to me one day, a woman, again, working on, or had an advanced degree, having children now, primarily being at home, and we're talking, and we're doing whatever we're doing, and at one point she stops and she says, I don't think you're ever going to fully understand what I'm talking about. And in, again, a better moment of therapy, as a therapist, I said, yeah, I think you're right. I'm never going to fully understand that. But here we are. Can we keep talking? Can we stay in relationship? And so that's an example of meeting where we cannot meet. So these differences don't have to be deal breakers, is what we're trying to say here, right? That's what we have to work across difference. We have to think about our power and privilege and positionality. My positionality is a man who didn't stay at home and raise the kids. I helped a lot with the kids, but I am under no confusion that my wife carried the vast majority of the mental load for our family, right? Who's going to eat what? When are they going to eat? Who needs to go where, right? The family calendar, all those kinds of things. Even the language of, well, I helped a lot. What do you mean you helped? Isn't this part of your job? Right? So all these kinds of things, and we just get socialized into these things, right? So even if I'm working, again, with someone who's different sexual orientation or gender, which I have, or race, of course, there's often these moments where I can't fully understand. In fact, I don't think I can fully ever understand anyone. Partly because I can't fully understand me. Can you amen on that one too, right? Amen. But that doesn't have to be a deal breaker. So I love this phrase, we meet where we cannot meet. So I want to just really quickly, I'm going to go through this. I want to learn to befriend my vulnerability, which includes guilt and shame, which includes a lot of regulation, which includes making a whole lot of mistakes. I must continually learn to recognize what Jacobs calls my taken for granted assumptive world. The way I see the world, I take it for granted, but I've got to constantly be challenged in that. For example, just a couple things. I don't ever question whether I'm welcome to walking into a store. I never think about driving while white. I've been socialized to think of myself as an individual and not a racial category. That was mind-blowing when I learned that people will look at me as a racial category. It's like, oh, okay, that's helpful to know. And I have to think about, here's just a few things, right? I have to always think about my maleness, my sexual orientation, my class, even my height. We were joking about that, but height's a real thing. I have a patient right now who's struggling because he's short. He's short, he's a person of color, and he's an immigrant. Yeah. Oh man, we're getting into it. It's really good stuff. I feel so privileged to be working with, and I'm so thankful I know some of the things I know, which I didn't know 20 years ago. So I have to think about all these things. And I have to acknowledge that I continue to benefit, right? I continue to benefit from my privilege, and that can be hard. So embracing our shame, embracing our vulnerability, I just want to say again that this is not easy. It's not easy, and it's been a long journey for me, and I wish we can go to coffee, and I can tell you more about what that's been like for me. I think Christin's going to talk some about her vulnerability and our relationship as well, and I'm just going to sit down for a little bit.
Go do that. When we think about vulnerability, there's so many things to pay attention to, and one of the things I loved in preparing for this presentation was talking with Brad about how we even experience our vulnerabilities differently, how we might perceive them differently for various reasons. Personality, of course, is a big part, but I think that personality is shaped by those other aspects of our intersectional identity. When I think about my vulnerability, and there are many different forms, I'm mindful of these aspects of myself that are salient to me. I'm an African-American woman of enslaved descent in the U.S. That enslaved descent piece is important because every Black person in the U.S. is not of enslaved descent, and I'm grateful and happy on their behalf. Praise the Lord. There are Black people who experience the world differently without the same heritage and history and its complex, oppressive aspects that I hold. I also hold a variety of other identities that intersect in complex ways connected to my power and privilege and positionality. I have several positions of relative power and privilege. That's how I'm here as a co-chair of this symposium, because I have some shared power that's been granted to me. Think about being highly educated, as a woman with multiple graduate degrees in multiple fields, how that opens doors for me that are not opened to other Black women. I think about the comments that I've heard from people that are actually quite difficult. I think about one comment in particular at my last institution where I served as a faculty member. I remember a Black woman had just been released from the faculty. It was their only Black woman with tenure on the entire faculty of 200 faculty. And I remember she had been released, and that's the term I'm using, that she was fired, but the institution doesn't want to use that language. And I think about the fact that in her release, no one came in as a Black woman of enslaved descent to come and be a professor at the institution since she had left. So I was the next person to come in. And I remember as I was discerning, will I go? I'm in the application process, in now the interview process. I remember someone saying to me, well, you're not like her, so you should do well here. And race was a significant component of her release from the institution. And I think about how disrespectful it was, not only for them to say that of her, but also of me, assuming that I didn't want to be like her because they didn't like her. And all the complexity of what that brought up for me to hold these things of like, oh, it's the degrees I have, it's my personality. Like, you're a different kind of person. You're a likable Black person. That's a whole thing, to be the likable minority who code switches not just with your words, but with your affect, with your emotions. And what does that mean? That holds a lot of different things for me as I think about every institution where I work, every church that I serve, the complexities of what I hold that are both privileges and also underprivileged aspects of self at the same time. I think about being a tenure-track professor at an accredited institution, what that means in terms of power for me. I also think about aspects of disempowerment as well. Just being an African-American, period, being a woman, period, thinking about being unmarried, period, being non-tenured at this point. There's so many things that actually impact lack in some kind of way. I want to say a little bit more here about a few aspects of how mutuality, I think, is really important for us in all of this. Give this comment, and if you want to say more here, you can. But we have an author that we think is really important, Lou Aaron, who has this particular book entitled A Meeting of the Minds. And in it, he defines mutuality, a key term for us at this conference, as this. Mutuality is when persons both influence and create a relationship of bidirectionality. Persons that both influence and create a relationship where both parties are impacting in a meaningful way. It is possible to have a relationship like with a mother and child where the child's subjectivity is not recognized. I think about all the seasons of parenting where I say children should be seen and not heard. There's a whole philosophy of education and a philosophy of personhood connected to that. What does it mean to think about the mutuality of a parent saying that your voice matters? Whether or not you can use your voice the way you want to might be up for discussion, but your voice matters, your perspective matters, your experience matters. That mutuality is where both parties are creating the relationship But it's also important to acknowledge that those relationships might be mutual, where they're bidirectional. I have a voice, you have a voice, but power is not always shared equally. And we also acknowledge that. This is where there is asymmetry in the relationship. Asymmetry exists where there might be mutual influence, but there is not equal power. We both have a voice, but our voices don't hold the same weight. I think about that in a classroom. My students' voices are very important to me, and those of you who are in class with me know I will sit there in silence until you speak. When I ask a question, it's often not rhetorical. I want to be engaged in dialogue. But I also hold the reality that there's a risk for a student to speak, whether in class or in office hours with me, because I am grading them. And they need that grade to graduate. And what does it mean then to acknowledge I hold a weight here and that there's an asymmetry of power, even if I desire for there to be mutuality in our relationship? We believe then that mutuality can exist in relationships regardless of the power dynamic. And the person with more power, like myself as a professor, in this case with a student, has to discern how to use that power, how to steward that power appropriately. I also want to talk briefly about thinking about mutuality and courage and how that's connected to my vulnerability for myself. I think about, in particular, my first experience of becoming a professor at my previous institution. And I think about something I'm extremely grateful for, which was the thoughtfulness of my first dean. I'm grateful also for the thoughtfulness of my next dean as well, who is here. But I think about the thoughtfulness of my first dean, Terry Watson. Terry is a woman who is extremely mindful of many things, and she's also a practicing clinical psychologist, so I could feel her clinical presence even in the academic space. And I remember when I first was beginning to discern if I would come to this school, she said to me during the interview process as a white woman, "Christin, I am mindful that minority tax exists. I am mindful that as a person of color coming into our institution, the likelihood is that not just your advisees will come and ask you questions, but any black person at our school, particularly given the fact that we just lost our tenured black person, is likely to come to you to ask questions about navigating the space, about life. The office hours will look different for you than they do for others. And I want you to know I'm going into your new position, holding that in mind. How do we think about your position in light of that?" My gratitude for her holding that, and not just me. She also had these regular mentorship check-ins where she would pause and say, "Let's just connect, and not just come find me when you need me," which would have been a really appropriate thing for her to say, because every dean has very limited time. Very limited time. But she said, in your first year, I want to have these regular points of check-in where it's already on the calendar. So you don't have to wonder when you will tell me about some of these things. You will just know on this date, in this month, we will talk. And you can bring up whatever you want. The structural safety that created for me as a new pre-tenured faculty member. I think about her allyship. We talk about that a lot, what it means to not belong to a particular community, but to join in some way, to collaborate in some way, to have some mutual relationship. But also her sponsorship, a term that I learned actually because of her. And I'll say more about what sponsorship means. Sponsorship then is this capacity to say that when I am in a room, I think about my mentees, I think about those who are under me, and I hold them in mind when I enter positions of privilege. So as a dean, she would go into meetings thinking, how might Christin benefit from the resources here, though she's not in this meeting? She wasn't just thinking about me, appropriately, she's thinking about other folks. How can I think about what they need? I hear that in our current dean here. I hear that in Brad as chair of integration. What does it mean to think about other folks who aren't in this room? How can my resources be used on their behalf? That's a sponsoring of the person. In this case, Terry found resources for me to attend something called the Faculty Success Program. I'm throwing it out there on the slide because I think it's really important. It still exists. There's a program for minoritized faculty or women or immigrant faculty who are entering the academy, having fewer resources externally, even if they're brilliant, to enter into a new space. That faculty success program required money, and I didn't have it. And she said, we will find a way to fund this so that you have what you need to navigate the academy in general. That type of sponsorship was her using her power and her privilege on my behalf in some meaningful, empowering way, using power with. Think about authorships and publications. I'll conclude with this. I'm also mindful that Terry wasn't the first person in my life to be paying attention to power and privilege in the academy. Before I ever got to work with Terry, I got to be here at Fuller and to work with Brad. Some of you know this already, but Brad was a member of my dissertation committee. He had a lot of power over me. It's very significant to think about. I need him to pass me with my research. I need him to think my ideas make sense. And I think about our power dynamic over time, what that's looked like over the 13 years since I've known him. And And I think about Brad's intentionality and his invitation, both as a student and through our working relationship now as colleagues. His mentorship over the years has been multifaceted and multiplicable. In graduate school, I remember TA opportunities that he would give to say, Christin, would you be interested in offering this perspective and leading this group? I think about his feedback on my dissertation to strengthen it, to say, this can be really strong, add this, think about this, not just good enough, this might be helpful. I think about after graduation, publication opportunities of him saying, hey, I have this privilege of actually being a special editor of a journal, which he is often for so many journals. Would you like to be a contributing author? And I remember at the time, like, I'm really burnt out. I just graduated. I don't know if I want to do anything. I actually just want to sleep. But I remember him saying, I think you would have something meaningful to say. I'm purposely asking this group of folks who are newer to the academy, newer and postgraduates, to think about how they might offer a publication with some reflections on your experience. I think about letters of recommendation that he's written for me over time. I think about then our transition from being a student and faculty to colleagues. And I think about, again, structural ways of paying attention to sponsorship and allyship and mentorship. I remember getting here and thinking, gosh, I now have to navigate a new system. I was somewhere else learning their system, and now I've transitioned out. And what it means then to have these regular points of connection for Brad to say, I will be available regularly, which we've been meeting for the last 3.5 years, regularly. Come by my office. Let's have these conversations about whatever's going on in your transition into the academy. Again, that sacred space that's already been set aside, that's slightly different than come find me when you need me, and we need both. We need the open door policy, text me anytime, call me anytime when you need to, email me. But we also need those things that might be regular, that we can rely on and depend on in some significant way, where time is a way of showing that we're prioritized in some way. Of course, that looks different season to season. The invitation to co-facilitate this symposium is another beautiful example. These spiritual retreats that we get to lead together for our students, thinking about the Integration Symposium, all of this over time is this shift of the power dynamic in our relationship, where he gets to still acknowledge that he holds embodied power even if he didn't ask for any of it. And I hold my own power, but not quite the same as his. And we get to then figure out what power looks like, moving from power over in our dynamic to power with, power to, power within. And that's primarily, I think, a lot of Brad's decisions. I'll say briefly as I wrap this section up here, that I do think what I've noticed in that process is I've noticed Brad's thoughtfulness and self-reflexivity. Brad pausing to pay attention. I get to observe that and learn from him pausing to pay attention to his gender, to his race, to his height even. That matters to me as a really short, petite woman. The height actually affects how I experience the world. I affects what's going on, whether I'm getting from my car to the house or whatever it is. Height is going to impact things. What does it mean for him to be thinking about those things, right? And not just me thinking about those things. That reflexivity or reflectivity is coupled with humility in some beautiful ways that I find inspiring. It's also his openness to feedback. I've heard him say on multiple occasions, Christin, I'm trusting that you'll check me if you disagree. I'm trusting that you'll tell me something if you don't think it's the same thing. And that's a privilege I don't take lightly. I'm not always thinking I'm going to check. No, it's Brad. That's okay. You know, he's the chair of integration. But if he's saying I'm expecting in our relationship there's mutuality, that you'll give me feedback if you think there's something important for us to consider. I'll ask a few questions that I think are helpful. And over time, then I've been able to learn from that in some really important ways as well. That's helped me find my voice, which you heard Brad talk about as a supervisor. He talks about that. As a faculty member, he thinks about that. What does it mean to give those who are new to a space or who don't have the same privilege space to find their voice in all of this, for which I am very grateful. I'll turn it back over to him to share a few things.
Thank you, Christin. That's awkward and also, but I think as we talked about it, we wanted to model that and we wanted to just, again, spark imagination. It's not because I'm awesome or I've always done this in awesome ways. It's been a long journey and it still is a journey.
He is awesome though.
So what about this from the position of power in my split? How would I describe this? And again, I don't know that I'm describing it real well here, but I think it has something to do with humbly accepting my humanness. Again, leaning into shame, leaning into vulnerability is to be able to say, I'm going to make mistakes, but I'm not a mistake. I'm going to make mistakes, but I'm not a mistake. But my intention isn't enough. You have to hold all those, right? My impact matters. So it's back to this differentiation of self. Can I stay thinking when I'm feeling? And can I manage that there's a tension here between intimacy and autonomy? You see it this way, I say it that way. That's mutuality, right? That's a challenge, and it's not easy. And I feel shame to this day. I can leave a class and go, I can't believe I said that. Or I wonder how that came across. Or a student checks me on something, right? I don't love those moments. But I make mistakes. I'm a human. And that's okay. And that's how I learn. So trying to be open. Letting failure not lead to collapse and fragility, right? But to be able to say, tell me more about that. What happened there? I'm sorry that I said that and that it impacted you in that way. Can we talk some more about it? Can we think some more about that together? So I've been blessed by colleagues like Christin. It is mutual and reciprocal and goes both ways. And I'm sure there are many times when Christin has silently put up with something. But I do trust her also to tell me and to check me. But I just name a few people here. Some of you might be in the room and some of you know who you are, and many others as well who I've learned by example. I've learned from being in similar spaces together. I've learned from their hospitality. I've learned from them teasing me. Right? When you have a good relationship, they could say, Brad, that's so white. That's so white that you just said that, right? And I don't feel shamed by that because I'm in a relationship with this person. And I know they care about me and they want me to grow and be better. And then even encouragement. Christin obviously is an incredible encourager, as you just heard. But that's helpful. But also I don't want Christin to do the work or have to encourage me so that I get good at it, right? That's not the job for Christin. I'm just saying that helps because it's like feedback, right? You go, oh, okay, so that's a helpful thing to say.
That's right.
So you have a way of doing that that's not sort of like, I don't know, patronizing or something, but it's like, oh, I should do that again. That's a helpful way to say that. Yeah, and then so I trust people like Christin, others to tell me the truth and to stay in relationship. And then again, for me as a white person, I try to read widely. Here's a bunch of names, and there's so many, and you know them all, right? I also really always encourage my students to read memoirs of people's lives that are different than yours, and to, of course, watch movies, go to plays, find other narrative, dramatic ways to engage and have your mind opened. Go to other parts of the world, of course. That's always an eye-opening experience. Not necessarily as a short-term missionary. Right? Because we can be colonializers in our short-term mission work sometimes. But to go and really engage in the culture and see what's there. Walking the Camino de Santiago in Spain the last couple summers ago was a unique, interesting experience. In some ways, you're like a visitor. In some ways, you're a little bit like a tourist. But we try to be pilgrims, and we try to be people who engage with and take in the culture and see what's happening there in the world and receive feedback. And those kinds of things are really, really powerful. I love this term, fear of dying of shame. Sometimes I think when we're in positions of power, privilege, and positionality, and we can die of shame in different ways based on our positionality, that we defend against this, right? Again, we're defending against their shame. I don't want to feel that. So what do we do? How do we manage that? And so this is kind of like to some of my white friends in the audience or people in positions of power and privilege. It's important to understand that our guilt is not only personal, we are guiltily situated. We're guiltily situated. We receive power and privilege oftentimes for things we didn't do, we didn't earn them, right? But because we have them, we are in a situation that we too are guilty. And that's very difficult for some people to experience. They don't like the idea of systemic injustice. During the pandemic, I was leading an online reading group in my church on race. And we got to systemic injustice, and a couple of the white people, and we had actually a multicultural group, a couple of the white people kind of lost their minds, right? They just could not grapple or understand this concept. I don't think it's that they couldn't understand it. I think psychologically they didn't want to feel guilty, right? And so even a term like guiltily situated sometimes helps folks. This is a sentence, and I'm just going to put it out there, and you may or may not like it. We can maybe talk about it if we have some time for conversation here. But perhaps sometimes what white people with privilege, power, and positionality need to understand, they might say something to themselves like this: while I may not be consciously racist, sexist, homophobic, etc., I may act unwittingly in those ways due to my implicit biases, and again, my power, privilege, and positionality. And as a person of privilege, I'm also part of a system that I benefit from, right? These are things that I think we in power have to name. If I don't behave in anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-homophobic, if I don't behave in anti-ways, then I perpetuate the status quo. It's not enough to go, oh, I see this. Yeah. We have to do more than that. I know you wanted to say something about that.
Yeah, just briefly acknowledging that we're going to slip into whatever our patterns are unconsciously unless we choose consciously to stem the tide. Unless we choose to say, I don't want to default to that. Then we'll have to decide, I don't want to do that. Then I have to, whether that's privileging other folks over ourselves in ways that we shouldn't. For some minority folks, that's often our issue. So I do default to thinking that the people around me know more than I do, that I probably am inferior in some way. That happens for students when we're new. Like, I guess I just must not know. Somewhere we have to make a conscious decision to say, I'm going to start thinking differently about myself in the world, and have to choose to be anti the things that are not healthy or good.
Jacobs also talks about the importance, again, of emotions, that to be able to embrace our shame is to, again, acknowledge, to feel our emotions. And that's difficult because we want to move away from that. We want to run away from what makes us uncomfortable. But emotions are contextually emergent. They happen within a particular context, in a particular moment, in a particular relationship. And they tell us that something's going on interpersonally. So pay attention to your emotions. For example, despite any racist intention, I may be in a guilty situation. I said something that's hurtful, right? And I should mind my emotions for a sense of confusion or a creeping shame to let me know that something has happened interpersonally. When I'm interacting with someone and I get a facial expression that doesn't make sense, I need to pay attention to that. I need to pay attention to, what am I feeling right now? Am I confused? Do I feel ashamed? Is something coming up for me? Something's going on here, right? And oftentimes when shame shows up at the door, we close and lock and double bolt it. And when I want to say that if you want to embrace your vulnerability, you have to go, bring it. Bring it. And I wish that was easy. It sounds easy when I say it, doesn't it? I also have to be aware of my dawning sense of my own ignorance and also not owning up to my ignorance. Sometimes you beat yourself up for not knowing what you don't know. So again, if I'm confused by someone's response or I feel anxious or defensive, I got to get curious. One of the things I love about Christin is she's very facially expressive.
It's true.
So you respond to things I say. Mm-hmm. And if there's something that surprises me, I mean, I feel like I know many of your expressions now, but if there's something that surprises me that's like a signal to me to like, oh, slow down. Or if we're missing each other, I'm like, oh, something's happening here too, right? So those are a few little things that go through my mind a lot.
I love that. So we're preparing to wrap up, and we'll give ourselves a few minutes to just briefly say what we think we've been highlighting and some questions that we think are helpful to sit with. These are rhetorical questions, but ones we hope you'll grapple with over the next few days and weeks. When we think about all these things connected to power, privilege, positionality, and our intersecting identities, we get to ask, what does curiosity, humility, and hospitality, these virtues that Dr. Erickson was mentioning at the beginning of our time, what do they look like for me in my context? For me to practice these ways of being as someone who follows Jesus. Can I be changed? It's a question for those of us in any position. Can I allow myself to be changed by those who don't have the same degree of power that I have or privilege that I have? For therapists, can I allow myself to be transformed by my clients or my patients? For ministers, can I allow those who are my parishioners or those who I'm serving at church to also impact me, even if I'm the Bible study leader, even if I'm the mentor? It's one of the most humbling and beautiful things to me when I think about my mentors making space and saying that I impact them. It allows me to mentor differently because I have mentors who do that. It's a privilege to receive that sense of being seen. As therapists or ministers who represent most of the majority, if you are a majority folk in some kind of way, whether that's heterosexually or in terms of race or something else, thinking about whether or not we foreground those same types of experiences in our work with other folks who also hold privilege. Brad asked a version of that question earlier. It's curiosity about what that means for those of us who are minoritized in various ways. And we get to sit with this final question is, can we learn to meet by seeing where we cannot meet? Can we meet by seeing where we cannot meet? Can we learn to name those things, to see those things, and hopefully mutually to make space for them?
We're just going to end with a couple quotes from an author that some of you may know. Dr. Philip Cushman was a psychologist and philosopher. He's a Jewish man. Wrote a lot on philosophical psychology. And his work focused primarily, however, on interpreting psychology as cultural history. That's really interesting if you think about it. Interpreting psychology as cultural history. He said, psychology is not a discipline that just emerges out of nowhere. It doesn't drop from the heavens, right? It's deeply, deeply influenced by the cultures in which it was created and by the people who created it, those kinds of things. So we have to pay very close attention to that. And so in this article, he's writing about white guilt, political activity, and the analyst. And I'll read part of this, and then Christin's going to read part of it. This is about being open to difference. Being open to difference won't happen unless therapists, and I added ministers there, are willing to take chances, to make mistakes, and pick themselves up again, to face the worst of what pops into their minds and out of their mouths. That takes the capacity to grant oneself the freedom to be human and to make mistakes, to recognize one's mistakes, to understand them, admit them, learn from them, and continue in relation with others. It takes the capacity to be open to others, to let them teach you something you don't know about them and something you don't know about you, to come to understand something about the world of others, which will in turn help you learn something new about your own world.
Cushman wraps up this quote by saying, none of this can happen if therapists or ministers are plagued by ethnic, racial, or class self-hatred. They collapse into shame about who we are, our histories, aspects of our identities. None of this can happen if we're plagued by ethnic, racial, or class self-hatred, or are counterphobic or too afraid of making mistakes, too afraid to be honest, and relatively free in their own responses. Nothing will deaden therapy or ministry relationship more quickly than a therapist or minister who is so terrified of saying the wrong thing. Nothing will deaden a relationship more quickly than being overwhelmed by terror to say the wrong thing. We think Cushman's words are an invitation to us then to see the terror or anxiety or overwhelm that we might experience and to welcome it. As Brad said earlier, to befriend it, to say, I'm terrified. I hope not to stay terrified, but I can welcome the terror at this moment and find hopefully some trusted others with mutual relationship to hold that terror with me, to help me work through it so I don't defend against it or minimize it in some way. I can find a truer view of myself, a more healthy, accurate view of myself. I think in all of this, as we've been sharing, our hope is that we will develop courage to look at ourselves more honestly and more fully. One of the verses that Brad and I have been thinking through for this presentation is the verse in the Gospels where Jesus says that you will know the truth. And you all know often the end of this verse, it's the truth that sets you free. It's the truth that brings freedom, the truth even when it's painful about ourselves, even when it's painful about the systems, the empire that we live in. When we get to see the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, then God really does help us. Then we really are able to be transformed. And I think that's such an important aspect of what it means to mind these gaps that exist before us. I don't know if you have any final thoughts you'd like to say.
No final thoughts. Thank you we just opened the fire hose on you, I feel like. God bless you. Thank you for hanging in there. We have a few minutes for questions. I think Dr. Erickson's gonna moderate that. So we'll just move over here. So if you have questions, we'll put that slide up there. You can text those in. Maybe you've already been texting those in. And we'll take some questions. And then we're going to have a nice long lunch break, okay? So that's coming.
So to name the vulnerability that Christin and Brad asked their boss to be the facilitator this time. We do have some questions that are coming in, but please take some time and think about your questions and send them in. But I do have some questions myself. So I'm struck by the ways that I came in with an idea of what vulnerability meant into the session. And I think I was thinking about what it means to then bring my vulnerability out. But I think one of the things I was hearing today is the sense of being open to my own internal process and the vulnerability of leaning into that, leaning into my own shame. So I'm curious how that resonates with you, if that's different, and then I might have a follow-up question after I hear your response.
Well, if I am understanding what you're saying, I think yes. I think you heard us correctly, or at least for me. Shame is obviously an interpersonal experience, right? Sometimes I'm interacting with internal people from my past as well. But in terms of leaning into our vulnerability, it is the counter move, not moving away from shame, not defending myself, but saying, what is this saying to me? It means, again, I have to be able to tolerate it and not go into collapse, right? Not to go into fragility, not to go into defensiveness. That's the work for me. That's the work. But that's what I was hoping to say.
Yeah. I think I would add, I think you are right in what you're picking up on. And I think our hope is that as we attend to our own internal sense of vulnerability, that we can do some of our work with ourselves, and then from there to be able to lean into relationships that we hope are mutual. To be able to say, now that I've been doing some of this work, I've become aware and begin to acknowledge and accept this is what's happening for me. I want to return then to the person where there's the rupture, or to the group where we need to work through some things, and to be able to allow that vulnerability to be held, hopefully in a trusted, brave space.
So that recognizing the ways that vulnerability actually can help empower you to be present in a different kind of way. Yeah. I'm going to ask, I think that empowerment piece was one of the things that I was thinking about in terms of what does it mean to then go into spaces where there may not be the same opportunity for a close, trusted relationship, but how do you show up authentically and vulnerably in those spaces? But I'm going to use that as a segue to this question from Julia. She says, as you discussed earlier, power includes the ability to name reality and shape how it is understood. As someone who is biracial, I often feel like the world decides what race I am before I get the chance to define it myself. If naming reality is a form of power, how does that dynamic affect biracial individuals whose identities are frequently assigned by others? What might reclaiming that naming power look like in practice?
So good. Well, first, Julia, thank you for the question. Whether you're in person or online, I'm grateful for it. I do think that power and naming are very closely tied, and I think it's important for us to be able to acknowledge the names that have been given us, along with deciding whether or not we agree with the name. We actually had this conversation in class, actually, with some of my first-year students a couple weeks ago. When someone says something about us, where they call us outside of our name, a different name that they use, or they say something about defining us, we get to decide, do I believe that? Is that actually true of who I am? And then what do I want to do with it, whether or not I believe it or not? And so I think there is something powerful for multi-ethnic, multiracial folks, and for many of us to be able to decide, what does my identity mean to me? I think some folks will decide this is what it means to me, and then they disregard what other people think it means. And I don't think that's our wisest option. I think it's important to say people perceive me in this way, and I don't have to agree with them, but I want to hold that they tend to perceive me or my people in this way. So then what do I want to do? What of that do I want to take? What of that do I want to put aside? What do I want to say when I say I am this person? This is what I mean by it. And sometimes we're explicit about it. If in a position like I am, sometimes I will say, this is what it means for me to be an African-American woman of enslaved descent. Other times it's happening more internally. I'm reminding myself, this is what it means for me to be me, even if other people have this perception of me.
Thank you. That's actually a segue to the other question that I had because of what you just said, Christin. Is it actually a privilege to be vulnerable? In the sense of there might be situations where you can't be as vulnerable, or it feels more risky, or there's an equity issue. Yeah. So I'm just curious about that question.
I'll give an initial thought, and I'm glad to hear your thoughts if you have any that you want to share. But I think choosing to be vulnerable out loud, to share or present your vulnerability, I think is a privilege. Sometimes we're so vulnerable, right? We're overwhelmed by something that I wasn't choosing to share, right? I just burst into tears. right? Or I just felt so overwhelmed. Or some of us, as Brad described, are so expressive that whether I'm consciously being expressive or not, right, you can just see something has been stirred up. But I think if we're talking about choosing to name, I think there is a privileged position there, or there is maybe more of there's confidence and authority, I think, that comes with doing that, and all of us don't have ready access to that confidence or authority. But I do think some of the work, even for those of us who have less privilege in some ways, is to be able to say, this takes extra courage for me. As Brad and I were preparing this presentation, I thought about some things I didn't want to say here. Like, I don't want to say that as me, even though I would say it in a different kind of context. And so what does it mean for me to say this is some of what I'm holding, right? And I get to choose not to disclose what I don't feel comfortable disclosing, but reclaiming, to the last question, some of that power to be able to say, I get to hold that and help people see that vulnerability in this way.
Yeah, and I would just say, I think it is a privilege to be vulnerable out loud. I like the way you describe that. I think we can lean into our vulnerability as an intrapsychic mechanism that really helps us and teaches us. And we talked about how my vulnerability or my shame is going to be different than yours, right? It's going to feel different. It's going to be engaged differently. We're going to do something with it differently. So this is not a call to unwisely start just opening your heart. Protect your heart, guard yourself, right? But I do appreciate that question about being vulnerable interpersonally or relationally. I think is also different than being vulnerable with our own self.
If I can just add briefly, I think the trust of the relationship that is co-created is what allows there to be room for deeper vulnerability. There's the obvious vulnerability that might just be sitting there, but genuine trust is significant. I think that matters.
Such great questions coming in, so I want to apologize if I don't get to yours. But there's a question here about the difference between power and agency, which I think relates to some of what you're just saying. But I want to connect that to another question that asks, how does this conversation then relate to training for therapists and ministers? So power and agency training, how do you think about those?
Well, these are really good, deep questions, and I feel like all my answers are going to be kind of shallow, but just an attempt to be brief. I really like that table we put up about power over, power to, power within, and whatever the last one was. Power for. We don't ignore our power. That's one of the problems, right? We have to own it and accept it. Whether you're training, chaplains or training ministers or training clinicians. I recognize when my students come in to do supervision or talk about a class or a grade or something like that, I have power, right? I just do, and I can't get rid of it. So that would be dumb to act like I can get rid of it or to pretend that it's not there. But I think, again, in my mind, I'm not trying to make little Brads. I'm trying to help Julia or Shia or Clifford. Naming some supervisors. I don't think they're here today. I'm trying to help them become the best version of them.
That's right.
Right? And again, I don't always do it perfectly, and I'm sure unconsciously I sometimes do turn them into me, just even by my open-ended rhetorical questions, right? So we influence each other, and that's okay too, right? Mutuality is that we in fact influence each other, but if we can talk about that influence, that's another way I think to kind of manage that. And I've had supervisees sometimes say, I feel like you want me to say this. Oh, that's so great. That's fantastic. And how brave of them, right? And then I go, oh, let's talk about that. Let me think about it. Am I telling you to say this? If I am, I want to take that back. If I'm asking you to consider saying it, to me, that's a different kind of conversation.
And I think to the question about power and agency, I do believe that agency requires power. To have any type of agency, power is a part of what it means to, I believe, to have agency. But it's, I think, important to acknowledge that there's different levels or degrees of agency, right? I can have agency over this part of my life and not over this other part. Think about those in collectivistic families or communities or societies, and that Often therapists from Western contexts will say, like, lean into your agency, set this boundary, do this thing. But what does it mean if, like, there are other responsibilities and expectations of my community? And so my agency exists within a collective, a whole. And so I have to acknowledge it's not just my thoughts, my decisions, my actions. There's also other folks who, in our community, like collective agency is part of how we even understand my own agency. It exists within a group. And so we acknowledge the complexity of that agency. And that means the complexity of that power that I have. I have power to affect perhaps this part of my life or this moment, but maybe not the other things in the way I might desire. And that requires, I think, discernment.
So as you talk about that experience of thinking about your own community and the influence of that, there are a couple questions here that relate to trauma and also the staying in mutuality when someone continues to hurt you. So just would love you to think about what it means to create that posture around mutuality, knowing that many folks, most of us, come with some sort of trauma history. Our neurons are going to get activated really quickly. Like thoughts about how that past hurt and or current hurt influences this process.
One thing that comes to me is thinking about pain and how we understand pain. I think that pain is a part of the human experience, and inherently, of course, pain is a part of trauma. Being traumatized in some way, victimized in some ways to experience some kind of pain, regardless of how we perceive it or talk about it or narrate it in some way. But I think saying that we're in pain also requires discerning like what kind of pain. So I think about often the analogy of like working out, something I aspire to often and do occasionally. And I think about like the piece of working out that I don't enjoy is the pain that comes with it. Like there's the workout that's like, oh, that felt great. And I'm like, yoga is always a great go-to for working out because I feel good immediately. Versus like Pilates, versus lifting, versus calisthenics, something else that there's pain connected. And I think about, I'm using this analogy because I think there's the healthy kind of pain. There's the pain like I know I'm stretching myself because it hurts. Actually, I have like little prompts in my like videos for workouts will say like, you should feel the burn. And I'm like, ooh, I do feel it. And I don't like it. But that's okay. That's a healthy kind of pain. And then there's the pain that's like, actually, you're injured. And earlier this year, I had my New Year's resolution connected to working out. And I injured myself over Christmas break. I don't even know what I did. It's like the sign of age. Like, I don't know how I hurt my knee, but somehow my knee is in pain. Exactly. Probably by sleeping. Just by lying there. And I think about at that space of like my knee was injured for about 6 weeks. I have no idea how. So all of my plans for the New Year's resolution of how I was going to like, be even more fit was like just collapsed for a while. But I think about what I had to do was to discern this is actually the kind of pain with this injury that I should not do the workouts I was doing before. The injury is telling me this pain is signaling this, I need to stop. Versus the kind of pain that's like, this is a good workout. Your body is okay. You can do this. Keep going. Discernment is required with pain. And so I think about relationships and trauma. It's not just the same as like you hurt me. That happens in any real relationship. We will be hurt. But when you've done something that's like cut a line across like my humanity, you've dehumanized and disrespected, objectified me in some way, and it's not just the one time. Sometimes one time is enough. You've crossed the line, that's it. Other times you are engaging in a perpetual way of such disrespect that this pain is not just this is hard. It's not just we'll have to figure out how to work it out. This is not mutuality. And even when you apologize, back to what I said earlier, the apology that doesn't hold weight, this apology is not a symbol of repentance. Scripture doesn't actually talk about apologies ever. It talks about changing your behavior, changing how you do life. And so if I'm in a relationship with someone who has hurt me deeply and they're willing to begin to change, do I have the capacity to make space in mutual relationship for that to begin to shift? Then perhaps we can stay in relationship even though it hurts me. But if you're hurting me in a way that ignores my humanity, even when you say you want to honor my humanity, then we have to have a different conversation. That's a painful conversation, but hopefully a healthy kind of pain to pay attention to.
Yeah, and I would just add really quickly that mutuality, again, is not it's not a prescription, it's a description. The idea is that in any relationship, both people are impacting the other. Now, not equally necessarily, but there is an impact, right? Think mother and infant. But there's also that asymmetry. So I think there comes many a time in a relationship where there's mutuality, both are impacting one another, where someone has too much power. And so trauma and infliction and dehumanizing is too much asymmetry. And then we need to leave. And we often need community to help us with that because we're often caught in these cycles of abuse and trauma, and we can't sometimes even see them.
That's right. And I think I would say the leaving piece, there's so many layers to if we can actually physically leave, right?
Thank you, yeah.
And I know you agree with this, on how we leave. So sometimes it's actually internal psychic leaving, right? That happens a lot, where I will distance myself. I will not be vulnerable with you, though we're still in a relationship. Think about those who are think about many women I talk about who are in abusive relationships. I can't leave because financially I can't afford to leave. But I have to adjust the relationship as I begin to discern what else will change practically and physically. And I can begin by saying I'm going to step away from what's unacceptable, what's disrespectful, what's dehumanizing, because we're no longer in a place where we can mutually actually work through that. Maybe we will be in the future. Perhaps there's a possibility for repair. Maybe you've crossed the line where repair doesn't seem possible this side of eternity. And we honor that painful reality if that's the case.
Well, I'm grateful. I think we are all full with just this reflection, the opportunity to ask really important questions, to even feel some of our own discomfort right now around ways that we might be impacted by this invitation to embrace and be invited to our shame and those spaces. Thank you for the ways that you've shown up today in that authentic and grace-filled way to invite us to this. And thank you for all of you and your questions to help us think deeper. So I'm going to shift over to Christin.
I want to say thank you to you all for being present with us. And I want to just give us a couple of comments as we prepare for our break. It's been a gift to be here, having these, I guess they're not really conversations because I haven't heard from you yet, but looking at your faces, I feel like I felt many of your feelings, and that feels like a dialogue of some kind to me. I want to remind us that we're preparing to head into a break. We're going to have some time both for coffee and pastries that are outside, so please enjoy them. And then we're coming back for a couple of workshops. I just want to note what those 2 workshops are. They'll happen simultaneously. The first, which will start at 1 p.m., the first is a workshop entitled Bearing the Weight, Immigration Enforcement, Mental Health, and the Work of Faith Communities. I have the privilege of hearing from our Central Latino community, those who are at Fuller and their partners, talking about what it means to bear the weight of this season, how power and privilege and positionality are being used in real time, how to understand that from an integrative psychological and theological missional perspective, and the multiple presenters will represent that beautifully. We also have a second workshop entitled Recognizing and Tending to Queer Miracles. Miracles in the gaps between. Working with LGBTQ individuals between, beyond theological battle lines. I'll say that again. Working with LGBTQ plus individuals between and beyond theological battle lines. I think it's so significant for us to pay attention to these opportunities for continued courage and conversation. So please enjoy this next hour and 50 minutes of a break for lunch and coffee and come back at 1 o'clock. We'll see you here.